Good morning and good evening and good night for some. Welcome to the fifth panel of our conference on the economic and social consequences of population aging, China in an international perspective. It's great to have such a wonderful panel this morning on social changes amidst population aging in China. If you have been in the previous panels, you know what the story is. But if not, I recommend you to go to the East Asian Institute YouTube website where you can find the previous panels. And the registration of this panel will also be there in less than a day, we hope. Today's panel, as I said, is a wonderful panel. We have great experts from around the world and from Singapore itself. We have Professor Merril Silverstein. We're very fortunate to have him, a very distinguished researcher in issues of aging. Amongst his many titles, he's the inaugural Marjorie Cantor Professor of Aging Studies and Professor of Sociology of Human Development and Family Sciences at Syracuse University. And among his many tasks is being the principal investigator of the famous longitudinal studies of generations, which has been running since 1971, when we were all young. Now we're all aging. But also, Professor Silverstein has done wonderful work in Anhui province, and he has done a longitudinal study since 2001. And again, that is still running, and having had some experience in studies, and especially longitudinal studies in China, that is a fantastic achievement. We have also Professor Wang he is, of course, the professor in the Department of Sociology in Tsinghua University, and he's also the associate dean of the department. We had him already at the introductory session, so welcome back, and look forward to your presentation. And then to counterbalance this truly intellectual might of the first two speakers, we needed three speakers from the East Asian Institute. So we have Dr. Zhao Litao, who is leading the sociology research in the East Asia Institute. We have Dr. Chen Jiwei, who is a researcher who is straddling sociology and economics in the East Asian Institute. And we have Dr. Shan Wei, who is part of the sociology group in our East Asian Institute. Of the three, two will speak, but Dr. Shan Wei is there for the difficult questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Merril Silverstein and his presentation on aging and long-term care in the context of family life in China. Professor Silverstein.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. It's really a pleasure to be part of this virtual conference, and really pleased to see the dynamism and such interesting topics being covered. As you can see from my title, I'm going to be talking about long-term care in the context of families within China. And I think it's safe to say that long-term care represents one of the major challenges, policy challenges, that China is facing in light of its demographic aging and its reduction of family size, because as we know, children, especially sons, are the principal care providers for older people. And in the absence of sons, and with smaller families and more older people and more frailty, the question is how the government or formal services in general will come on the scene to provide care and fill the gap that family might leave behind. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to be treading some familiar ground that I'm sure you've heard in other presentations at this conference. The aging of the Chinese population and the disease burden that this might impose on the society, how family structure has changed within Chinese families over the last few decades. And then I'm going to switch into something that people usually don't look at, which is the preferences for care expressed by older adults, both in urban and rural China. I think most of the debate in terms of long-term care focuses on finances, focuses on the organization of care, And all of these things are crucially important, but very few people have looked at preferences and what older people actually want in terms of their care location and the types of care that they would receive, and then end it all with some implications for public policy. Next slide, please. This is a smooth graph of the total fertility rate in China from 1961 to 2012. And as no surprise, you see a really precipitous drop happening up to the institution of the one-child policy represented by this vertical line, followed by kind of a steady decline up to the 2012 point, but continuing down and pretty stable in subsequent years. But basically what I want to show here is that families have become smaller. They've become smaller both in rural and urban areas, but particularly in urban areas. And this represents, in some people's minds, a possible deficit of family support for older people. Now, it's not a coincidence. In fact, it's a cause that this phenomenon is related to population aging, which you'll see in the next figure. This is the percentage 65 and over. Change the slide, please. The percent 65 plus in China over 100-year period, projecting into the future. And if you see where we are right now in 2020, we're kind of at an acceleration of the curve, which will peak out at somewhere around 25% in the year 2050. So we have this, what we might call a perfect storm of more older people in the society, fewer children to take care of them, and what we might see as a kind of a disorganized, or at least not a very fleshed out vision of long-term care within Chinese government and in terms of policymakers, although that can change very quickly. And I suspect that we will be seeing new policies on the horizon as China deals with this large number of older adults who may need care, some of whom may need institutional care, others may prefer to be at home and get home care. And I'll talk about that distinction a little bit later. So next slide, please. Along with this number of older people expanding, we also see the disease burden surging within China. And this shows you the number of older adults, men and women, who are experiencing a chronic condition. And you can look at people 45 and older here, and you see in the middle part of the curve, those who are in 65 to 80, let's say, that expansion is occurring at present in 2020. In the green, you see a larger number of people experiencing a chronic condition that may require some form of care. But if we project, again, another 10 years down the road in the red, you see an even larger increase. So we're seeing not only older people on the scene in bigger numbers, but we're seeing more chronically ill older people in the population, again, being served by fewer children in their immediate families. Next slide, please. This is seen in popular media accounts, and I took this out of the New York Times. China's birth rate hits historic low and looming crisis for Beijing. In a country where most older adults rely heavily on their families, the continuing drop in births could have a seismic effect in the decades to come. And you see these kind of words, at least in the popular press. We as academics tend not to use these apocalyptic words, but I think seismic might be the right word in this case, because the cultural underpinnings of care, which normally would have come from intergenerational sources, may not only be absent, or at least weaker, they have changed in reaction to economic changes, migration, as well as maybe a shift in cultural values and a weakening of filial piety, which has kind of been the undergirded the family support system for older people. Next slide, please. The next slide shows you a kind of a cartoon depiction of the what was called the 421 problem, now maybe the 422, because it's a two-child policy. But the point of this is that you see that there are fewer people in younger generations caring for parents and grandparents, and you have this kind of special little prince child who is being doted on by older generations. But if you turn the clock ahead for that little baby, you're going to see a fairly intense burden of care that they will face without siblings to help them provide support to the two older generations you see in the picture. So although we see sort of this phenomenon being depicted in various ways, I think the demographics of this is really quite telling and may introduce severe challenges for how older people are going to be served if it's not going to be family. The only other mechanism to pick up the slack is going to be the government or some form of public-private partnership to provide long-term care. Next slide, please. So the long-term care environment in China is pretty decentralized, I guess you could say, and that long-term care services, that is institutional care, in-home care, social assistance, exists in many forms across the country, but not in so much of a unified, organized way, at least at present. I think that's moving toward that, but it's very much a decentralized system. Most older adults, if they need to get long-term care, especially in an institution, unless they're very poor and rely on public assistance, they can't afford to pay for private long-term care services. So policymakers in China are concerned that older population will put strains on the formal care services system if they can't pay out of pocket for the care that they might need. And then another issue that comes up often in this discussion is how filial expectations are changing, whether children have the same level of commitment to serving their older parents and older generations as they have in previous times. This idea that filial piety, the Confucian norm that children are expected to care for their parents, may be in decline, or at least changing shape, right? Moving maybe from care to providing money. And this is a particularly acute experience for the single child who has to maybe weigh their own economic success against the kind of care that they would be needed by their parents. Next slide, please. So I'm going to address three research questions. First is, what are the preferred sources of care in the current older population of China? The second is education of older adults and their children associated with a greater willingness to use residential care. And do older adults with smaller and sonless families favor residential care to a greater extent? And this last question, maybe the most important, is about whether older people see long-term care facilities as a viable alternative to care from their children. Next slide, please. I'm going to address these questions using the Longitudinal Aging Social Survey, or CLASS. This is a nationally representative survey of the 60-plus population in China, fielded in 2014 by Renmin University. Consists of 11,500 older adults within 28 provinces. And for this analysis, we're going to use about 10,000 respondents who have children 25 and over, at least one child 25 and over, in both urban and rural hukou. And you see the split in that distinction. The survey focuses, it's a general survey focusing on health, family functioning, and various forms of health and well-being. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about three different attitudes or preferences that older adults hold toward care. And the first is, who do they think should be responsible for care of older adults? Should it be the government? Should it be children? Should it be themselves or their spouse? Or should it be all these sources together? Second, where would you like to receive care? In your own home, in the children's home, or in a residential facility, really a nursing home? Would you be willing to use nursing home care? And under what conditions would you be willing to use it? And here we asked about whether they would be willing to do it if their health was poor, if they were lonely, and if their family relationships were strained. Next slide, please. So who should be responsible for taking care of older adults? And here the urban-rural split is very telling. You can see that government is not a very popular response, but it's more common in urban areas. But the big difference here is about whether children should be responsible for taking care of older people. And not surprisingly, almost 40% of urban older adults say children, but 60%, almost 60% in rural areas. So you see a very sharp distinction about expectations of children, where the more traditional rural areas, where the families are bigger, children are more favored. Next slide, please. And then the next question reflects personal preferences. Where do you plan to receive care in the future? And here we gave choices that you see below. And you can see that most people wanted to get care in their own home, 73% in urban and 67% in rural areas. But maybe another telling difference here about the importance of children is that 30% of rural elders will plan to get their care in their children's home, only 19% in urban areas. So this reflects sort of a preference for being in your own home or your children's home, but much more in your children's home in the rural areas, again, reflecting the importance of family and kinship and children's responsibility for older parents. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to look at willingness to use nursing home by various characteristics that I mentioned earlier, whether education makes a difference, whether education of children makes a difference, whether family size makes a difference, and whether lack of sons makes a difference, and whether older people prefer to go to use a nursing home or long-term care facility. Next slide, please. So this is the baseline distribution of willingness to use a nursing home. And you can see that, again, not too surprising, that 36% of urbanites would use a nursing home under some conditions, the ones I mentioned before, being sick, having family strain, or being lonely. These were all grouped together. But only 20% of those in rural China would consider, under any conditions, using a nursing home. So again, 16% difference. Older adults in urban China are much more friendly or amenable to the idea that a nursing home might be a better living arrangement for them if they needed it. Next slide, please. In terms of education of the respondents, you see a near linear relationship, both in urban and rural areas. You see the urban bars are higher, meaning there's stronger preference to use a nursing home. But you see a gradient by education where almost 50% of those who have gone beyond high school would consider a nursing home in the urban sector. In rural, it's much lower, but you still see a stepped relationship. So education seems to be very important, and that could have to do with knowledge of nursing homes, could have to do with the ability to pay for nursing homes, because it might be correlated with success in economic success and so on. And I do also want to say that these results hold up in multivariate analyses. I'm showing you baseline numbers, but we've done a paper where we look at a lot of control variables entered into our equations, and we see the same basic pattern that I'm showing you here. Next slide, please. This shows you the preference for nursing home care by children's education. And here we had to summarize it by having no college-educated children and at least one college-educated child. So it's a pretty strict cutoff. But here you see that in urban and in rural areas, if older adult had a college-educated child, they would be, less likely to use a preferred nursing home. Now, this probably has to do with more traditional ways of accommodating care. Actually, now I'm looking at this, I think these numbers are switched. So I'm going to skip this slide, but I think this is actually done incorrectly. But so if you want to think about this in reversed, we can go back to it. So now we look at family size, and family size tends to be important in a kind of a linear way as well. That in urban China, if you have one child, again, we're not looking at the gender of the child, but if you have one child, almost half of those with one child will be willing to use a nursing home, and that goes down as family size increases, right? So more children, more resources to draw on for care. Same thing is true in rural China, but not as dramatically, right? You see that decline, but it's in urban China where family sizes are smaller on average, produces a stronger preference to use a nursing home. Next slide, please. Now, we also wanted to look at willingness to use a nursing home by gender composition of the family in combination with size, because the bigger families tend more to have a son within them. So we wanted to control for those two things together, and this is basically an interaction which turns out to be significant. But I'm going to draw your attention to the labels first. On the left, you have the two bars reflect urban residents. To the right, you see rural residents. And then you see family size, where one child family is in blue, two children in orange, three children or more in green. And on the x-axis, you see the family composition in terms of gender. So you would have daughters only in the families on the first bar, and at least one son in the second bar. It's a little complicated, but it boils down to differences that are fairly straightforward, and that really reflects the differences in the one-child family. So the next slide kind of points it out. If you go to the next slide, you'll see where those differences are in the one-child family. Next slide, please. So in urban China, you see that single-child families that consist of a single son, right? Older people with those kind of families are more likely to want to use a nursing home. But it's the reverse in rural China, where those older adults with a single daughter are more likely to use a nursing home or prefer a nursing home than those in rural China with a single son. And one could argue here, at least the difference is actually bigger in rural China and statistically significant. And we come away with that saying that there's a little more uncertainty about getting care from a single rural daughter who might move and be absorbed by another village or another family and not be there to care for their parents in a more patriarchal society where having a son might be more important. All right, so that kind of ends my empirical part. I'm just going to sum up a couple of main points in the next slide. Takeaway points: older adults in China prefer family care. They prefer to remain at home or live with their children, and this is especially true in rural areas of China. Residential care or long-term care in facilities or nursing homes is preferred only by a minority. But when we probe deeper to see whether it's entertained at all as a possibility, we see that the numbers tend to be larger and they're endorsed more in urban than in rural areas. Next slide, please. This summarizes the basic results I showed before. Almost half of higher educated urbanites were willing to use nursing home care. We think that might be related to greater resources or maybe weaker family expectations among the higher educated in urban regions. Older adults with more highly educated children are more likely to consider nursing home care. This is the slide where the numbers were reversed. And here we think that if you have highly educated children, they might have resources to help pay for long-term care. You're more willing then to use it. Or it could have to do with the migration of highly educated children that make long-term care facilities more attractive to older adults. Those with smaller families are more likely to consider nursing home care, and that's more than half of single-child urban parents. Size matters. Family size seems to be a very strong predictor of whether older people are willing to use nursing homes. And then the interaction in rural areas, those with single daughters, and in urban areas, those with single sons, were more likely to consider nursing home care. And again, here we can kind of link those two findings in terms of greater care uncertainty. For daughters in traditional patrilineal rural culture, there might be uncertainty about whether they are going to be available to provide care. And for sons in the more modernized urban culture, may be seen as less reliable sources of care. And so single son families may be kind of opening the possibility for their parents to consider formal care services. Next slide, please. Implications of all this? Well, the fertility decline I talked about, population aging and disease burden may move China to developing long-term care policies such as long-term care insurance, such as we see in Korea and Japan. What I've showed here today or tonight is, or this morning for many of you, is that segments of the population where there's greater uncertainty about care may support the development of long-term care insurance and long-term care services. So there are pockets in the population that are more willing to use it and may support policy initiatives that move in that direction. The last thing I'll say is that filial piety, the responsibility that children have for their parents, may need to be redefined or may be redefined, where long-term care becomes a companion to child-provided care. So that older adults can live at home and get some care from their kids and some care from long-term care services. Another way filial piety may be manifest is the ability to pay for your parent to live in the best possible facility or best possible nursing home. And the last slide I'm going to show you is an example of that kind of facility. So if you go to the next slide, please. Renzi City is what we would call in the U.S. a continuing care retirement community that houses both healthy and frail elders, and people can get the care they need up to intensive nursing home services. You can see the price of this. I've converted into dollars, $100,000 to $250,000, and this is quite expensive. And so most older people can't afford this. And turns out that the marketing they do is really toward the children, the young adults, the middle-aged adults who have parents who need this sort of housing environment. And it could be that your ability to provide that to your parents may be a demonstration of your filial piety values. This is, I believe, outside of Chengdu. I haven't visited it, but I heard a presentation about it, and you can see how beautiful it is. I mean, who wouldn't want to live here, right? It's quite lovely, gorgeous, landscaped, and there are a lot of amenities and sports that are available for people, but also intensive care facilities that one could make use of as health deteriorates with aging. So I think the mix here may be in terms of family and informal care together may produce a package that could be consistent with Chinese values in what I know my colleagues call doing it the Chinese way. So I'll end there, and I want to thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Silverstein. It's a very interesting discussion and how these preferences change. It came up earlier in the conference as well on how this filial piety is reinterpreted or maybe redefined under very different resource circumstances, and that translates in part into the elderly care, but maybe also in healthcare. It's interesting that you mentioned that the marketing is towards the high end and towards the children, and we have Elena Glinskaya online of the World Bank, and she actually led a couple of old care financing projects in China, and basically she was pitched many times some real estate development that she had to say no to, but she can talk for herself later on in the discussion. Our next presentation, Professor Wang Tianfu, is presenting the research finding of the research group in SSS. I don't know what that is. You need to explain that, Professor Wang, of Tsinghua University. So he's presenting of an ongoing research on cognitive impairment among the elderly in China. One of the key problems, one of the key expensive problems that not just China but many countries around the world are facing. Professor Wang, please.
Thank you, Dr. Hofman. Basically, the research group in School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University. In Tsinghua University, we have a research center on the aging society. For this particular study on cognitive impairment in China, we organized professors in the School of Social Sciences, some professors from the medical schools, and some other researchers from the Peking University. So we have a research group, and basically in this study, we want to have overall research on what's the current situation of the cognitive impairment among the elderly in China. So today I'm going to present some initial results from this study. Next, skip 2 slides, please. Next one. Yeah, first let me give you some general information on cognitive impairment. basically cognitive impairment. It's a description of condition of cognitive disorder. As we age, so we experience some decline in memory, attention, and some other problems. So the incidence rate among general population in cognitive impairment is varies from 21.5% per thousand to 71.3 per thousand. CI, which is cognitive impairment, basically have two causes. So the severe CI have two main causes. One is from Alzheimer's disease, another one is from blood disease. The problem caused by cognitive impairment is very severe. So among the elderly, 11.2% of the disabilities is caused by CI. Comparing to, this is a very big figure. Comparing to that figure, disabilities among the elderly caused by stroke, that figure is 9.5. Disabilities among the elderly caused by blood problems is 5%. So this percentage of disability possibly caused by cognitive impairment is really high. Among the minor cognitive impairment patients, about 44% will finally turn into dementia, which is a very severe dysfunction of mind. While among the normal elderly people, only 1 to 2% will develop to dementia, this problem. Next slide, please. Yeah, according to study by Alzheimer's Disease International, which is an international organization, they issued a report in 2018. So there's 50 million of cognitive impairment patients around the world. So that figure is increasing very quickly, about 10 million for each year. So by estimate, by 2050, there will be 150 million of cognitive impairment patients around the world. The spending on this problem is very high. So in 2018, so the estimated costing spending on cognitive impairment, treatment or prevention, it's about 1 trillion. That figure will double till 2030. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next I'm going to present some trends of prevalence of cognitive impairment in China. So based on two studies. Next slide, please. One is from the results is from the Charles study from the Peking University. So they have a longitudinal study started from 1998. By now, so they have published 7 waves of studies. So this particular figure presents the prevalence of cognitive impairment among the elderly, 65 and above. For simplicity, so we just look at the numbers at the bottom line. In the bottom line, this is age standardized prevalence of CI. So we can see it. The figure varies around above the 10% from the 11% in 1998, and then so the highest is the 11.8% in 2008. And then after that, so in the last two waves, we can say two figures, which is under 10%. So the last wave, we can say a percentage at 8.88. So there is a roughly flat figure, and then after 2010, so the figure slightly dropped. So this study covers 7 waves and involving more than 72,000 elderly people. Next slide, please. So this table presents the results from meta study. So this study, so our researchers collected published articles from 1990 to 2013. And among this time period, there are 28 studies discussed about the prevalence of dementia, which is a very severe condition of cognitive impairment. So we cut the time period into five phases. So we can say there's a slightly increase of the prevalence of dementia among men and among women. Of course, so at the last, in the bottom line of this table, so we see a slightly decline of the prevalence of dementia among women and in the total. So this study involves more than 77,000 elderly people, and among those elderly people, there are 2,788 patients of dementia found. Next slide, please. So this table gives the estimates. It is extrapolation based on the previous meta studies of 28 articles. So this is estimates of the national figure of dementia patients in 2030. So the estimates show among the male, so 6.9 million dementia patients will be found, and 9.6 million of female patients of dementia will be found. And then we can say there's an age group distribution varying from 1.1 million in the age group of 60 to 64 to the 6.1 million dementia patients in the age group of 85 and above. So in total, there will be 16.5 million of dementia patients in China in 2030. This is a really high figure. Next slide, please. And then, so we can give some points from the previous two studies. So one published research has divided the developing steps of prevalence of cognitive impairment in a society into 3 phases. One is so it starts from the low life expectancy and the low prevalence of cognitive impairment. And then in the second stage, it's a high life expectancy with high prevalence of cognitive impairment. So after that, so in the third stage, it's a high life expectancy with low prevalence of cognitive impairment. So in China, the particular case, so 2010 seems to be the turning point. Before 2010, there's an increase of prevalence of cognitive impairment. After 2010, there is a slightly decline. This trend is very much similar to what has been found in some European countries. Professor Prince is from the London University, London College, issued a report by the Alzheimer's Disease International in 2018. Basically, he discussed the same declining trend in the developing countries. Next slide, please. Talking about the prevalence of the cognitive impairment by age groups. So we found a study talking about discussing the prevalence rate by different age groups in the U.S. So in the age group of 65 to 74, the prevalence is 3%. In the next 10-year age group of 75 to 84, it's 17%. And among the elderly aged 85 and above, the prevalence is 32%. We find a similar pattern in China. Basically, for each age group with 10-year increase interval, so the prevalence of cognitive impairment basically doubles. So that's the trend of prevalence of cognitive impairment by age groups. Next slide, please. So we also look at factors that cause cognitive impairment. Next slide, please. These factors varies widely. The background, of course, is the population aging. So as people age, so their body starts lose some of their functions. Of course, the incidence of cognitive impairment most severe, most important causes is chronic diseases among the elderly, among which high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol. Basically, these three are the biggest killers. And then some of the bad habits also influence the incidence of cognitive impairment. Namely, it's smoking or drinking, and then low cognitive activity will also make things worse. So there are other factors we found in China among the 28 studies. Being female with low education, living in the countryside also have a higher incidence rate of cognitive impairment. Next slide, please. So this table we gives the comparison of the East Asian countries with Singapore and the US on the inadequacy of physical activities among the adults. This is from the study in 2016. And in this figure, we can see it in China. So that percentage is really low, probably indicating Chinese people or Chinese adults is very busy. And so in China, it's almost So looking at the total column, it's more than half lower than all the other countries in the percentage of adults who are inadequate in physical activities. Next slide, please. And then, so we talked about the bad habit. So let's just look at the drinking problem. This figure will also give out the we give the comparison among the Eastern Asian countries with Singapore and the US, looking at how much they drink among the adults 15 years and above. We can say the Eastern Asia countries, China, Japan, Korea, all have drink, comparing with Singapore, all drink much more. So this the number 8.3 means 8.3 liters of alcohol consumed. So in a total year. So of course, in Korea, the alcohol consumption is the largest among the 3 East Asian countries, and we can say in Singapore, the alcohol consumption is much lower, and surprisingly, in the U.S. Is only lower than that in the Korea, even a little bit higher than China and Japan's figure. So of course, so we can say these 3 Eastern Asian countries has a very high risk in terms of the cognitive impairment caused by bad life habit of drinking. Next slide, please. So what can we draw from our initial studies? Next slide, please. Of course, right now, so we don't have effective treatment for cognitive impairment. So the prevention is a much better strategy. In order to do that, so the first should be identify individuals with high risk. So what age group, what particular type of people with with particular chronic disease with a higher risk in cognitive impairment. So we need to identify them, and then so we need to develop effective prevention measures. So in addition to that, so the physical and cognitive activities should be improved among the elderly, and of course, one of the most effective measure should be the chronic disease prevention. Next slide, please. So what can we do? On the government side, so should be working on plans toward developing guidelines for chronic diseases among the elderly. So in our study, we have reviewed the central government and some of the province or municipal government. So they all are drafting some health guidelines for the elderly people. For the second, for the financing side, should be speeding up insurance coverage for long-term caring for the elderly with chronic diseases. So in China, as Professor Silverstein has talked about, in China, the long-term caring insurance is very much underdeveloped for the elderly. in the background is the quickly population aging. And for the enterprise side, for the market side, probably developing new technology that will effectively monitor personal activities for the elderly people and collecting their own health data and suggesting prevention measures specific to each of individuals. That's very, very have a very good perspective. So some of the enterprises in China, in Japan, are tackling this side, this problem. So for the government, for the financial side, and for the market, probably all these three they can do in dealing with the collective impairment problem in China. So that's my presentation, and thank you. Back to Dr. Hofman.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. We next go to my colleagues from the East Asian Institute, who's going to talk on the profile of China's aging cohort. Dr. Zhao Litao will speak, and Dr. Chen Jiwei will speak next. I will keep you to 20 minutes because we have a lot of interesting questions already pending. If you want to submit a question through the Q&A button, please do. And the other speakers in the conference, they can, I'll pull them in the back room later on so they can even ask live. Please, Dr. Zhao Litao.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. This is a joint effort with my colleagues, Dr. Chen Jiwei and Dr. Shan Wei. So we use multiple waves of survey data to describe various aspects of social life of the Chinese across cohorts. So I will do the first half of the presentation, and Jiwei will do the second. Next slide, please. We adopt the life course approach. So according to this approach, not only life stages are interconnected, but life stage transitions are shaped by historical contexts. Therefore, it's important to understand both intra-cohort inequalities and inter-cohort differences. Next slide, please. Scholars working on China have taken note of life-changing events like the Communist Revolution, the Great Leap Forward and the famine, the Cultural Revolution, etc. So, for example, Finian Chen's co-authored ASR paper found that due to the historical events, the impacts of socioeconomic status on health and health trajectories differ across cohorts. So we follow this line of research, but we shift focus to more recent social changes in China, which we argue may be less dramatic than the Communist Revolution or the Cultural Revolution, but no less profound in terms of socioeconomic impacts. Next slide, please. We give two examples here. One is the Great Leap in higher education. This happened between 1999 and 2006. So in 1998, China's new tertiary enrollment totaled only 1.1 million, so roughly only 6% or 7% in the college age group had a chance. A few years later, new enrollment increased to 5.5 million in 2006. So higher education expansion obviously benefits young people. Another example, pension extension to non-working populations is even more dramatic, from about 100 million in 2010 to nearly 500 million in 2012, so in just 2 years. This trend immediately benefits those aged 60 and above. So these are just two examples. They are likely to have different impacts on different cohorts. Educational expansion raises questions such as delayed marriage, or foregone marriage for young people. Pension extension could reshape people's opinion of who should be responsible for providing elderly care. So in short, China is experiencing compressed development. Life chances can change quickly between generations. In fact, the very definition of generation can be different now because of compressed development. So next slide, please. So in this presentation, we provide descriptive analysis of education, marital status, and other aspects of social life across cohorts. Next slide, please. So we use Chinese General Social Survey data, CGSS data. We select 3 waves, 2005, 2010, and 2015, and analyze the urban sample. So we divide each wave into 9 age groups from the first group, 30 to 34 years old, to the last group, 75 to 79. Next slide, please. So we begin with education. The first group to benefit from the great leap in higher education would be those aged 30 to 34 in 2010. So in 2015, beneficiaries expanded to 2 age groups, 30 to 34 and 35 to 39. So if we look at the 2015 data, that's on the right side, for the younger cohorts, every 5 years, there was an increase about 10 percentage points in tertiary enrollment rate. So indeed, it was a great leap. Next slide, please. So now the gender gap in higher education. CGSS data show consistent gender gap in access to higher education, even for the young cohorts. So this finding is surprising to us because the literature suggests convergence actually between males and females over time. Next slide, please. So expanded education often leads to delayed marriage or even foregone marriage. So globally, marriage rates are declining. In China, marriage rates are still very high, but if we look at the blue bars, singlehood is increasing for the young cohorts. Next slide, please. The average age of first marriage has been increasing more for female than for male. Next slide, please. If we focus on singlehood, we see considerable increase from 2005 to 2015 for males aged 30 to 34 and 35 to 39, and also for females aged 30 to 34. But if we look at the bottom line, singlehood dropped sharply for women aged 35 to 39. So in other words, Chinese women are delaying marriage, but not foregoing marriage. So marriage norms are still strong. This is in line with the previous literature. The important question, of course, is given the trend, whether marriage norms will still be strong 10 years or 20 years from now. Next slide, please. For older adults, we are interested in the rate of widowhood. So CGSS data show a large gender difference, especially for those aged 70 and above. So this raises questions about living arrangement and elderly care for widowed women. So how do Chinese families cope with these life cycle changes? Next slide, please. So this chart shows the pattern of living arrangement. So in general, solo living, the blue bars is on the rise across all the age groups. Living only with spouse, the orange bars, is also becoming more common across all the age groups. Next slide, please. An important question I mentioned earlier is how Chinese families deal with the challenge of high widowhood among women aged 70 and above. So this chart shows that in 2005, more women lived with their children than solo living. So also the percentage of solo living was much lower than the percentage of widowed women aged 75 to 79. So Chinese families indeed were making adjustments. Next slide, please. But in 2010, we see some change. So more women in the age group 75 to 79 had solo living than living with their children. Next slide, please. So the trend continued in 2015. So not only those aged 75 to 79, but also those aged 70 to 74 were more likely to live alone than live with their children. So of course, solo living is shaped by many factors. So how widowhood affects living arrangement is a question for further investigation. Next slide, please. So from the 2010 wave onward, CGSS asked respondents for their views on who should be mainly responsible for providing elderly care. So 4 options: government, children, elderly people themselves, or shared responsibility between government, children, and elderly people. So if we compare 2015 with 2010, the general trend is that across nearly all age groups, fewer people think children should bear the main responsibility. So this finding suggests that the traditional norms of filial piety may be adapting to the new reality. So the decreasing number of children and the wider social security coverage are shifting people's expectation for greater roles played by the government, elderly people themselves, or shared responsibility. Next slide, please. So the literature suggests that the norms of filial piety are changing. For example, from obedience to mutual support, from duty obligation to emotional support, from patrilineal to more gender equal. But CGSS does not have questions on filial piety, but these are important changes. So now I'll hand over to Dr. Qian Jiwei. Jiwei, please.
Thanks, Dr. Zhao. So previously we talked about one major shocks from the policy side is the great leap in education since late 1990s to people's education level or income level. So now we are going to look at the second policy shocks, which is the social insurance expansion. Next slide, please. So the social insurance expansion actually initiated in late 1990s to accommodate this state-owned enterprises reform. Pension and health insurance were initiated during that period. But since mid 2000, there were pension and health insurance reform programs initiated to enroll those informal sector workers, residents, students, retirees into the social insurance system. So that's a big expansion in the social insurance programs, as Dr. John just have shown in previous slides. The pension program actually started, increased by fivefold between 2010 and 2011. So the pension actually was the rural pension. And the resident pension started around that period, and also health insurance for residents and the rural residents and the urban residents also started in 2000. Next slide, please. So all those social insurance are basically initiated to protect people from adverse shocks such as unemployment, health shocks. So that should be change people's behaviors a lot. But these figures shows the coverage of social insurance for in the labor markets. It has been increased to about 70% for health insurance and similar level regarding to the pension. But if you look at the bottom line, it refers to the gray line. It refers to the enrollment rate for migrant workers. So for those groups, the traditional unemployment insurance, they are not. Those migrant workers are undercovered by this unemployment by the employment-based social insurance. Next slide, please. So we use the data to look at the CGSS data to look at for different cohorts the social insurance coverage. So compared to 2005, this is the bottom blue lines. In 2015, the enrollment rate increased a lot. So the question now in the CGSS basically asks people, it's a very broad question, whether you are covered by any pension programs or not. So the coverage rate actually include both traditional employment-based social pension and also resident-based pension in those questions. So if you to interpret those difference, it seems to the lower a younger cohort has been supported by social insurance in recent years a lot. So especially for between 30 years old to 45 years old. So for those groups, it's more likely the many migrant workers are part of this cohort. So they are more likely to covered by this resident social insurance program. Next slide, please. So that's basically the implications from the data. So the residents and the resident-based social insurance seems to play a role to protect the younger cohort from the data. Next slide. So the situation is similar for health insurance. If the coverage rate for the younger cohort actually improved significantly compared to the older cohort. So that would certainly follow this life cost ideas. Certainly will affect the people's life, in the coming years. The next slide, please. So the pattern for those social insurance are quite similar between pension and health insurance. Next slide. And the other interesting issue is if you look at the labor market performance in China since 2000, the real wage rate increased in double digits every year. Next slide, please. So we look at the retirees relative income ratio compared to the working age people in recent years to see the pattern of the retirees income level and whether this affect people's decisions in the labor market, especially for labor participation rate for the elderly group. Next slide, please. So this is from Professor Li Hongbing's paper. So this shows the input want to show the very quick growth rate of real wage rates in China. Next slide. I also added two additional waves in this graph. So it shows the 5 waves of CGSS data to look at the relative income between the age 60 to 79 to the working age group 30 to 59. So the trend is decreasing. So the relative income between the elderly group, older group, and young group is decreasing in recent years. Next slide. So with that we probably can imply the people may with this decreasing ratio of income between older and younger cohort, probably people may want it implies the higher real wage rate in the labor market may induce the elderly cohort to work in the labor market. So next slide. So indeed, it was supported by the data. If you look at the retirement age, in recent years, the retirement ratio actually decreased for elderly cohorts. Next slide. So employment ratio actually increased in recent waves for the age group older than 60 years old. So that's about 10%, around 10% labor participation rate, in the labor market. So it's much higher than the 2005 wave. Next slide. So I skip this. Next slide. So the general conclusion for this paper is that we show these interlinked life stage indicators in education, marriage, living arrangements, social insurance, and labor market behaviors. And also we argue that those major policy changes in education expansion and health insurance, and also people's income may have changed income level may have a persistent effect for different age cohort. Thank you. Back to Professor Hofman.
Yes, thank you very much. And as we move towards, I'm getting some echo, which is solved now. Thank you. I actually believe that your charts on pension enrollment and health enrollment are wrong, because it shows from 2005 a jump to 2010 and then a drop back to 2015. I think simply your colors in the charts are wrong, because I think it was a steady increase, as you say, but the charts are not corresponding. Just for later, that was something spotted by Sarah Tong. We have a lot of questions, and I'm sure we're going to have some of our other speakers as well. But let me start with a question from Aline Wang online for Professor Wang. And in a way, it also applies a little bit to Professor Silverstein. It's about gender differences in the experience. Professor Wang, can you say a little bit more about the gender difference between of disability burden, especially cognitive impairments between men and women? And for Professor Silverstein, it's related, comes from Sarah Tong. Is there a clear preference, a difference in preference in care between males and females, elderly males and females? So we'll start with Professor Wang, please.
Yes, so actually this is a medical question. So my best guess for the gender difference of the prevalence of cognitive impairment between men and women is because of the male looks to me is much more active in terms of physical activities as well as cognitive activities, usually than female. So in that case, so the daily movements for the for men probably is much more. So that's why. So in developing cognitive impairment among men is slightly lower than women. That's my guess. Yeah, I haven't read medical reports about this yet. Yeah.
Professor Silverstein, difference in demand for care between male and female?
Yeah, I was just checking my tables, but I can't find them quickly enough. I don't think we found any once we controlled for a host of covariates. So, we controlled for education and personal income and all other kinds of things. And I don't think we find much in the way of gender differences and preferences. Those differences might exist without the controls, but we can explain them away. I think most of the differences and preferences has to do with the gender of the children, not so much the gender of the older respondent themselves. So that probably tells you something about how expectations are formed. I mean, one could probably make a case that gender of parents interacts or intersects with gender of children. Maybe men and women have different expectations depending on the gender composition of their family. That's conceivable. But we didn't go down that road. But that's a very good question, and I don't know quite the answer to that. But we haven't found anything in our multivariate results.
Thank you. Christine Wang had a more broader question on sort of how does China compare? Maybe Christine, Professor Wang, why don't you ask the question live? We'll pull you in, I hope.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. Sorry. On Professor Silverstein's presentation, it was very interesting to hear about people's preferences on how they live in their retirement. I wonder how the preference for living alone and living with children versus going into an institution seems to be common around the world. So I wonder if you can talk about how China differs and how these differences in China might point to different, the need to plan differently, for governments and for social organizations and society to better plan for caring for an aging population in future. And while I have the floor, I'd like to ask a question of my colleague Zhang Li Tao and Chen Ziwei. When you show the very big jump in pension coverage from roughly 100 million to now over 500 million over a very short period of time, this is quite an achievement, and China's won the ISSA award. I can't remember what ISSA stands for, a big international award for this sudden and remarkable achievement in coverage. But in fact, the coverage is extremely shallow for over 400 million of these pensioners or people who are covered in the pension programs. So the basic residence pension is not really something that they can live on, right? So that it doesn't really provide a better sense of social security, independent of their own savings and independent of children. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Questions to me in the beginning. Let me just say that there are certain universals I think we can observe, and that is really nobody wants to go to a nursing home. If you ask people where they prefer to go, very few people mention nursing home. But if you give them conditions, right? So say your health gets poor, your family can't take care of you, whatever, you start seeing some acknowledgement that it could be a reasonable alternative. And that's kind of what we see in the data. But baseline, really very few people will entertain the idea as a preference to go to a nursing home. I think where China might be somewhat different than other countries is that it's a very much, I think we could agree, a top-down policy environment. And what we don't see are the internal mechanisms by which China comes to policy decisions. So, pensions will just sort of magically appear within China without kind of a lot of public debate anyway that I can see. And we kind of see these big programs coming on the scene very rapidly. We might see something like that with long-term care. The only issue is that it can be phenomenally expensive to provide, good quality long-term care to this vast number of older adults. One way China, in my reading, has kind of pushed this decision into the future is by pushing filial piety. I think we see, a great emphasis on Confucianism and so on, over the last few years, and sort of the, famous stories of adult children being dragged into court because they didn't care for or see their parents, right? That kind of thing. That's more of the, more of the stick and less of the carrot. But you can also use a carrot, and that is providing financial incentives for children to engage and express their filial piety, kind of work with those internal feelings that are still there, but enable them to be manifest and have another piece of let's say, care in the arsenal that one could then combine with formal care, some kind of a hybrid model. And I think, I'm guessing that some kind of public-private partnership may be the way that China will go. But that's completely speculative on my part.
If I might follow up on that, in your data where you show that parents who have college-educated children seem to expect less to live with them. So, coming back to the point about filial piety, I hope that it doesn't mean that people who go to college become less filially pious, but rather that the alternative is better, that there are economic resources that they can draw on to care for the parents, short of having them live with them. So that would be one point. The other thing I just want to say is that in studying China over the last 3 decades, one thing I've learned is that China always surprises us on the upside. So it's a country that learns very, very fast. Things are changing extremely fast. And institutions, nursing homes in the countryside are really dreadful, the ones I visited. So nobody wants to go there. But, over time, they're going to improve. And, you already showed in Chengdu that you have really beautiful assisted living arrangements in urban areas. So, all of China is moving in that direction. And so people's choices are going to change, and their preferences may change very rapidly along with that.
I agree. I won't say any more, but I want to give the other people an opportunity.
All right. We have a few online, and then I go to Sarah Tong. I know she has a question, but I have 2 questions for Professor Wang online. And the first is, to what extent is cognitive impairment related to socioeconomic factors such as income and rural and urban living? And related this was a question from Dr. Kong Tuan Yuan, and related a question from Ko Pei Chun. Can you elaborate a bit more on the policy actions that government can do to prevent long-term cognitive impairment? What has proven to, and maybe Professor Silverstein has suggestions as well, but what are the best suggestions that we have on the table thus far?
All right, thank you, Dr. Hofman. First of all, I add one more point to the previous question. So I digged up the data. I didn't find any age-specific prevalence of cognitive impairment among men and women. So I suppose so there are more women who live much longer than men. So that's probably one of the most important reason why there are many women inflicted with cognitive impairment. That's one more. So for the income side of implication of the cognitive impairment, for the people who are inflicted with cognitive impairment, the most problem right now in China probably is the long-term caring. So this is related to Professor Silverstein's topic. So right now, the manpower and the finance. So in dealing with caring of the elderly people with severe cognitive impairment, basically they are partially disabled in their daily life. So that's a problem. So that problem is facing by both the urban families, urban households, and as well as the rural households. so manpower and the finance. So in that case, the Chinese government is quickly doing some experiments. I believe in 5 or 6 cities. So they are trying to expand the long-term caring insurance policy in 5 or 6 big cities to say if their experience of effective. So I think, in my personal point of view, they will sooner or later, after they experiment in those cities, they will make some revisions and then put forward in other in the whole country in terms of financing the insurance of long-term caring for the elderly. Back to you, Dr. Hofman. Yeah.
Professor Silverstein, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I think one of the ways that many countries have reduced cognitive impairment among older people wasn't intentional. It was through education. I think if we look at what's predicted through different cohorts that kind of has lowered risk of cognitive impairment, it's been the elevated education of the population. So that's kind of can continue within China, will further reduce the risk. The other thing I think is environmental. There's a lot of evidence now that air pollution enhances cognitive impairment, that the particulates that are in the air, especially the smaller ones, get into the brain and cause various impairments. And this is not dementia, not Alzheimer's disease. It's really a form that it comes from the environment and everybody's exposed to that. This could be kind of have a huge effect on the population if that can be reduced even by a fraction. So if we're thinking about large-scale public health initiatives, I would say improve the air quality, and that would actually improve functioning, improve all kinds of health functioning, but especially cognitive impairment, which is what our interest is here. So I would say those things. Now you can get to the more micro level and provide more stimulation for older people. I don't know exactly how senior centers are funded within China, but at the local level, having older people engaged in learning new tasks and new skills is a way to kind of stimulate the brain and at least, if not prevent dementia, at least push it off into later ages.
Well, having lived for 9 years in Beijing, that was not a very good message for me, but Professor Wang, it's even worse. Fortunately, the air quality in Beijing is improving a lot in the recent decade. I'm going to give the final question to Dr. Sarah Tong.
Thank you. Thank you. I typed in a question for Professor Wang, and I tried to remember that. It's about the inadequacy in physical activities. I didn't quite get. You went through that table quite fast, quite quickly. So I wonder if you can clarify a bit more. 2 aspects. Number 1, is China's trend the same with the other countries? In terms of physical activities, inadequacy in that relation. The other one is about gender and rural-urban variation. I believe your table did have those aspects, but I didn't quite catch that. So if possible, could you elaborate a bit more on that one? What's the main conclusion? Thank you. Sorry. Thanks.
Okay. Can I go on, Dr. Hofman? Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I opened my PPT, and then so from the table. So for China, the inadequacy of physical activities. So the international standard, I believe, if I'm not wrong, is 150 hours per week for the moderate physical activities. So in China, so the table shows China in general, Chinese adults is the percentage with inadequacy of physical activity is much lower than the other countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and the US. So which means more Chinese adults are in the good shape of physical activities. So for the male and for the gender difference, female actually they do more physical activities normally. So that figure is 16% for men and 12% for female, who are in the inadequacy of physical activities. So, Dr. Hofman.
Thank you. Look, we had one more question on the role of international organizations now, on how they can help China, and I don't know whether that's more directed at me, I think, but really Dr. Elena Glinskaya will talk about this later in the program, so I won't spend too much time. Just in brief summary, what I find really interesting at this point in the discussion that we had, but also in the coming discussion, really China is at a stage when there's a lot of things up in the air. Society is changing very rapidly, and supply of services for elderly hasn't yet gelled, but demand is also changing quite rapidly, and the financing is yet unclear. Frankly, it's a hot potato. Nobody wants to pick up the financing and say, this is going to be the structure and this is what we're going to do. And as a consequence, you probably get an under provision of a lot of services that would be there if there were some arranged financing of some sorts. And within that current state, there's a lot of experiments going on and enormous amounts of initiatives in all kinds of provinces and cities. I mean, I've seen what I was most impressed by. I've seen sort of the WeChat type of applications where you can, as an elderly, you can order online the various on-demand services that you want to have, and they get delivered to you, including massages and manicures, and but also literally exercise and stimulation. To the real estate development, institutional care that is being pitched quite excessively, frankly, and China runs a risk in this vacuum of policies and regulations, runs a risk in ending up in a highly institutionalized environment, from which a lot of Western countries had to come back because it's in the end too expensive, especially for the poorer part of the population. So I find this really interesting, and this elderly care and elderly service, medical as well as cognitive care and other type of care, daily support for elderly is an important area. But as I said, I think at the moment China runs the risk of ending up in a too expensive a system, and that's something that policy needs to take care of. We're going to talk about that in some of the next panels as well. For this panel, I'd very much like to thank the presenters. This was great. Professor Silverstein, Professor Wang, Dr. Zhao, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Xiangwei, and the other panelists and the people that have asked questions. Thank you all very much. I look forward to the next session tonight. This session should be on the website by tomorrow around this time, maybe even later tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.